Hey everybody, so here we are, 3 lectures to go. This is for outline 14, Tuesday's lecture as of yesterday, the 26th, and I'm gonna go ahead and touch on chapter 6 and the epilogue. I feel that Rodriguez is, what he's been trying to tell us is that with the story of maize and the connection that we have to maize as a people across both continents, North, Central, and South America, that story alone will fill the gaps that Vigil, the previous author from Indians to Chicanos, had focused on the fragmentation of our history. When a people don't have a cohesive history, they are left to fill in gaps. And as an individual and as a collectivity, all peoples, all humans, as a tribe, eventually as a nation, they share a common bond through a story, and the story varies depending on the symbols that are around them that remind them of that story. And so in losing our stories by the attempt by the colonizer to replace his story on top of ours, if not destroy our story, or even attempt to use our wisdom, our knowledge base, and put it on top of his and claim it as his, leaves us disoriented as a people. Worse yet, in not only in our territories, but if we move to another territory, particularly where another story is the master story, the master narrative, which I've mentioned several times. What's the USA has a master narrative, just like Canada, they have a master narrative story, and we don't have our own story, because in our previous territory they reinvented a story. Mexico invented a story about the Mestizo nation. Peru has probably a similar one. And other nations across Latin America have their own master stories to justify their existence, to give people a sense of pride. But once you break down and you put it against the reality and the material connection and symbolism, those stories fall apart because the reality cannot sustain it. The United States is an immigrant nation, but when you put it against reality, it falls apart. The United States is a settler nation, not an immigrant nation. It's a settler nation built on native land, and built by slaves, primarily native and then African, and then low-wage slaves, which came in waves from the poorest sections of Europe at one point. So you're acquainted with all that. Now, in chapter 6, the chapter is titled Axis Mundi. And Axis Mundi is a Latin term for the center of the world, what holds the world together. And their story revolves around their myths, which also get integrated, overlapped, or forced into a story that ties to the religious belief systems that they brought 500 plus years ago. Now we have our own center of the world, our own Axis Mundi, and Rodriguez has been arguing that ours is based on maize and its stories. And so you'll see through the story on chapter 6, where he is talking about Quetzalcoatl, and how Quetzalcoatl had his dialogue with the ants. Now that story itself is what survived of it, are bits and pieces of it. What he's done as an author is fill in the blanks to bring larger themes into being. You'll find out also in the epilogue that he's got another story. It's about La Llorona. We usually have a very short version understanding of La Llorona, and we usually use it to scare our children. And once again, the author takes the liberty to expand on that story to try to find meaning, depth, in both the Quetzalcoatl's origin story of maize and also La Llorona, us, the children of this particular mythical figure that runs the streets at night particularly. And they're all symbolic, they're all symbols, they're all part of that semiotic argument he begins in chapter 5, I believe, or maybe 4. And as he proceeds, what he does is help us try to decipher that those stories that you hear, they're just for you to be able to transfer them to the next generation, until one day a generation like yours pauses to try to understand the depth of it and try to piece it together. Despite the 500 years of displacement and violence, enslavement, and even a continual exploitation of people, even here in 2020, where we hear Trump trying to persuade Congress to lower wages being paid to guest migrant agricultural workers. That action itself, that little action itself, a powerful action in the context of government and power, that is tied to this 500-year-long process, which is also tied to resisting it through rebellions or cultural resistance. By taking a Chicano class, that is one little piece of your attempt at trying to understand your story, trying to grab a hold of your axis mundi, and in the process replacing it with the one that you were taught since you were really young, to be made feel like a foreigner, to be made feel like less, like to be made feel that your people didn't contribute to anything of significance, that somebody else built this nation, when in reality it is all these pieces coming together across a short period of time. What took us several thousands of years to stabilize our societies, stabilize our identities, create stories around that, all of a sudden gets co-opted in a brief period of time of humanity to tell us that we don't have anything of significance to have contributed. And so in discovering that you have, that you personally have, that your family has, that your community has, that your nation has enriched many of peoples across the planet, it begins giving us a sense of that there is a value that we not only contributed in the past, but we're still contributing today. And in the epilogue, another thing he brings up, which I thought was neat, was that maize-based concepts. Now, I've been looking at Chicano studies for a long time. And in the stories, there's a lot of truth, but also there's myth. And so myth doesn't have to be a bad thing. Myth doesn't have to be dismissed as not real. See, myth holds a place for a child whose curiosity remains active through part of his life and hopefully the rest of his life. And so myth shouldn't be dismissed. Instead, it should be seen as a tool to hold on to a knowledge that opens up a door to our reality. So maize, Quetzalcoatl, La Llorona, and other stories are important and relevant as vehicles to be able to keep the stories alive, keep that resistance alive, keep the rebellions alive across these continents. Now, he also brings up these concepts called the maize-based concepts. They're a recent invention. They're not necessarily, they're indirectly tied to reality, but they're also at the same time, we borrow them and put them in the myth context to give value to our existence. And so he brings in la catch, you are my other me, or panchebe, to seek the truth, humnapku, creative force, men, believe, create and do, kochil, responsibly educated, it's accepting full responsibility, and finally yashche, ba'alche, all is one. What happens to one happens to all. this is the relevance of the story, the Axis Mundi, the myth, all together, mixed together, to give us a sense of belonging, a sense of reality, and a sense of wonderment. And lastly, he finishes his epilogue with getting away from competition, the competition of the narrative stories, the master narrative stories, the one when you come to this country where they're pressuring consistently through their indoctrination and their school systems to assimilate you fully and make you disappear as the individual, despite the fact that they bring up that word a lot. So many things to think about, and I'm looking forward to the last 3 lectures. Take care.